Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 10th of April 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. And we begin with a very sad report that brave child abuse campaigner Robert Green is seriously ill in hospital. And I have to say, I was able to visit Robert yesterday, and he was in agreement that he would like his supporters to be informed of how things are going. But I have to say that he is in a very difficult position. He has a very aggressive cancer, and Robert has already been in hospital for about a month now. So we will keep you updated on progress. Robert is able to take a limited amount of correspondence from people closer to him, but at the moment in hospital he isn't able to take a lot of correspondence, and we know that in the past he was in prison receiving hundreds of letters a day at one point. So we're going to say that anybody who would like to write to Robert, who is not, if you like, on his close friends list, can do that via the UK column. And the address is on screen at the moment. That's UK column, Unit A2, Phoenix Mill Business Park, Estover, Plymouth, PL6 7PY. So our thoughts very much go out to Robert and his family. But I have to say to our viewers and listeners that Robert is seriously ill. Great shame, Mike.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we thought we would just add to that. Of course, Robert's campaign has been against child abuse and try and get exposure of abuse where it's already happening. And I know that he'd support us carrying part of this report. Here's the Daily Mail with a very big article that a gay couple have been jailed for a total of 38 years for abusing a young boy who was in their care. So this is a particularly unpleasant case. But of course, it's remarkable that we have once again these two men who can be identified as abusers. They can be convicted. But when it comes to pointing a finger at people who are within the political or the wider establishment, the UK and the UK government seems to have a huge problem being able to push through with prosecutions. And so we'll remind people that at the moment we're supposed to have a so-called independent inquiry into child sexual abuse going on. But of course, we've been pointing out time and again that this inquiry is itself flawed because it is being highly selective in which evidence it will and which evidence it will not hear. This was a letter that I received back in August 2018 telling me that essentially the inquiry wasn't going to hear evidence from Melanie Shaw. And that has been the case with other people who we believe have got vital evidence. So what is going on here? It appears to be an exercise to make the wider public think that there is an investigation, but the investigation is not really independent and it's not being pushed with any vigor or determination. And we'll remind people of this remarkable statement by Alexis Jay, the chairman of the inquiry. She said the inquiry wishes to make clear that the fact certain individuals will be named during this public hearing does not mean that the allegations against them are true. This investigation is, quote, not examining the truth or otherwise of individual allegations. The inquiry is simply addressing issues of grave public concern. I've read that again today, Mike. I obviously read it at the time. That was the Times published that on the 4th of March 2019. And I find myself thinking, what exactly is this lady saying? The inquiry is simply addressing issues of grave public concern. What does that mean, Mike? Can you give me a clue?
One thing it might mean is that they think that they're giving the public some kind of safety valve or some way of letting off steam.
Yeah.
The public believes that there's an inquiry going on, but the inquiry isn't really there to discover the truth. But yeah, don't worry about that, because they're at least helping the public come to terms with what's been going on.
Okay. Well, if we pop that one on screen
Right,
again.
I was being sarcastic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, we'll just add that what's going on here is a cover-up, in our opinion. And we'll add this one. When it came to looking at what had been happening with the abuse of children in Westminster, they said this: we're setting an agenda for the IICSA Westminster inquiry, and UK column adds, an agenda to manage the wealth of evidence that British politicians were involved in child abuse and that the government and its agents covered up that abuse, which is still ongoing. We'll keep labelling this an orchestrated cover-up. And we're going to remind people that, of course, we've had senior members of the intelligence services coming and admitting that the intelligence services knew children were being abused, but they did nothing because they felt that it would cause political embarrassment. And of course, this attitude still going on. This was Lord Lexton speaking. He said, "My lords, these reforms," that's the police recruitment criteria, "mean that in future only men and women of the very highest ability are appointed to the post of Chief Constable, unlike Mr. Mike Veal, whose disastrous Operation Conifer has inflicted such dreadful and unfair damage on Sir Edward Heath." So the state, it seems to be constantly very nervous of any inquiries coming near politicians or higher members of the establishment, but the state can prosecute people, we will say, at the lower end of the spectrum, as they should, for the abuse of children, but we seem to have protection for those higher up. And I'm sure that Robin would like me to give a special mention to the BBC, which seems to work so hard to obfuscate any investigation of child abuse in the establishment. This was one of their documents going back to 2015, where they produced quite some text of all the different investigations going on. And then, of course, subsequently, we've heard almost nothing. And we'll just remind people that it was the Holly Gregg abuse case which first drew or caught Robert Green's attention. And he's worked so hard since those early days, many years ago, to expose what is really happening to children within UK. And in the little embedded graphic on screen, we've given Melanie Shaw, Beechwood child abuse whistleblower and survivor. We've mentioned her. We're mentioning the cover-up of abuse at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College. We're also mentioning Ben Fellows, who had to go to court to try and clear his name effectively after speaking out on abuse. And we still, of course, are deeply concerned with what happened with the abuse of the two youngsters in Hampstead. So all of this is very much still going on. But as we say here, there's no effective action by the government, the police, IICSA, or the child abuse agencies or charities to protect children. And as a last comment, Robert thanked all of you who have sent him cards. Those were a big boost for him. I asked him if he had any message to people who were supporting him in his work, and he said, "I'd simply like all those people who are still concerned about what's happening to children in Britain to do their best to speak out for those children and to get the law, the proper law imposed to tackle those crimes." So a very emotional statement from Robert Green. And of course, he's worked so hard to try and do something about this.
Okay, let's move on to the online harms white paper. We mentioned this on Monday, had quite a segment on this on Monday. This is potentially the complete shutdown of free speech in this country. But anyway, we're going to have a major section on this on the UK Column website by the weekend. But in the meantime, I just want to remind everybody, of course, the release of the white paper on Monday begins a 12-week consultation process. And so I want to encourage everybody, or as many people as possible, to get involved in that consultation process. But I thought we would just have a look through a couple of the comments that various people have made subsequent to the release of the white paper. So here's Damien Collins, who's the chairman of the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. He said, "I'm pleased the government has accepted the central recommendation of the DCMS Select Committee's report on disinformation and fake news, that social media companies should have a legal liability to take down harmful content hosted on their platforms." So he's certainly explaining what the real target of this is. It's not child abuse, it's disinformation and what they describe as disinformation and fake news. He said, "We made the case for funding for the regulator to come not from the taxpayer but from a levy paid by social media companies that operate here. We're pleased that that's been adopted. The Select Committee will be holding evidence sessions with government ministers and regulators to discuss the white paper during the consultation period. In particular, we're keen to understand how quickly they will move to publish draft legislation and introduce it to Parliament. There is an urgent need for the new regulatory body to be established as soon as possible." And this is a theme, this urgency, and we'll come on to that a little bit more in a second. Disinformation, he said, is clearly harmful to democracy and society as a whole. The social media companies must have a responsibility to act against accounts and groups that are consistently and maliciously sharing known sources of disinformation. Right. Okay, so he then complained that the white paper doesn't address concerns raised by the Select Committee for the need for transparency for political advertising and campaigning on social media. But don't worry, because that's going to be addressed separately by the Cabinet Office. Of course it is. What is the Daily Mail talking about with respect to this? Well, they're reinforcing Damien Collins' issues here. Racist tweets aimed at footballers are still online up to 5 years after being posted, despite Twitter's pledge to take action. So Daily Mail not concerned about the potential ramifications for free speech here. They want Twitter and Facebook and so on to go through every historical tweet that's ever been made or Facebook post that's ever been made and make sure that the internet is retrospectively regulated. And make sure that stuff that nobody's ever going to see again unless they specifically go out of their way to discover it, make sure that that's all removed. Now, Norman Lamb, then, he's chair of the Science and Technology Committee. He said, "We're pleased to see the government has decided to make a duty of care a central focus of white paper." Now, of course, the duty of care aspect of this is the justification for the whole thing because they're really in the beginnings of the report, trying to present this as being some mechanism for preventing, abuse of children, for preventing suicide and preventing self-harm and so on. Norman Lamb very excited about that. Now, the Guardian's coverage of this, they said the Guardian view on online harms, a white paper, grey areas, there was one paragraph that struck me on this. They said, "There is no doubt that some forms of disinformation, such as anti-vaccination propaganda, do serious harms both to individuals and to society as a whole. But does the government really want fines levied on the executives of YouTube when the platform promotes conspiracy theories or anti-vax videos? Regulating the internet is necessary, but it won't be easy or cheap. Too much of this white paper looks like an attempt to find cheap and easy solutions to really hard questions." Well, the Guardian is missing the point completely there. This isn't about cheap and easy. This is about fast. This has been an issue that the UK government has been pushing since David Cameron made a speech to the UN General Assembly. I thought it was 2015. In fact, it was 2014 when I went and checked yesterday. So this has been something that's been on their radar since 2014. Yeah. They've got themselves to the point now where they're almost in a state of desperation to get any counter-narrative to what's coming out of Westminster shut down as quickly as possible. Yeah. So this isn't about cheap and easy. This is about fast.
Yeah. And why has this occurred, Mike? It's occurred because basically social media, which did have some, we'll call it some holes in the beginning, but many people are putting out very good quality reports. It's backed by evidence, documents, facts, and this is causing the government huge problems, of course. So this is a vicious attack on free speech in order to protect the government, without question.
Absolutely. Now, one of the organisations that commented was the Commission for Countering Extremism. Well, they're now producing a new series of reports on extremism, because apparently Britain has a massive extremism problem. Now, of course, if you go back to that David Cameron speech to the General Assembly, you'll understand that extremism is everything from terrorism to speculation about 9/11 or 7/7, everything in between. So this is all about extremism research. The Commission for Countering Extremism has today announced, they say, that leading academics we've commissioned to write research papers on the far right, Islam, the far left, and online extremism, among other topics. So they've commissioned this. They've selected 28 experts and academics with a wide range of expertise, from extremism to community cohesion, after a competitive bidding process. So there you go.
Independent. I'm sure the word independent is in there somewhere.
Absolutely Mike. Independent. Yes. So let's have a look at the academic papers that they've commissioned here. What have we got? An overview of the far right, a paper mapping the spectrum of far right worldviews and groups, from those close to mainstream public and political life to the most violent fringe. Mainstreaming the far right, a paper exploring how and to what extent the far right has entered mainstream and political life. National action, links between the far right extremism and terrorism. An overview of Islamism. So a paper mapping the spectrum of Islamist worldviews and groups, from those close to mainstream and public. So there we go. Then we're going to have one on mainstreaming Islamism, because we've got to do that. We're going to have links between Islamists, extremism and terrorism. And then we're going to get onto other forms of extremism. So one paper exploring the tactics and objectives of the far left and their acceptance among the public. Then we're going to have one on drivers of extremism. 3 papers this time, exploring how and to what extent extremism is influenced by external environmental factors. Then we're going to look at they're going to look at extremism online, apparently, exploring how social media affects extremism online and offline. They're going to critique approaches to countering extremism. So 3 papers exploring current and alternative approaches to countering extremism. And finally, understanding effective approaches to changing attitudes and behaviours. This is 2 papers examining past and present methods and techniques to change attitudes and behaviours that may be applicable to counter extremism. So my question is, Brian, does all this, because clearly they're producing 20 different papers here, clearly there must be a massive extremism problem in this country, not just right-wing extremism or Islamist extremism, but left-wing extremism as well. So is there anybody that isn't extreme in the UK that we need to have this level of investigation? Or is it that, in fact, what they're doing is generating the future narratives that they're going to use in order to pursue this policy of shutting down free speech?
It's a self-fulfilling circle, isn't it? That you whip up all this, you have these people who will not be independent. They're going to produce reports that are exactly as the government wants, to prove that there are these extremists in all these different categories. And then based on that, the government is going to implement this behaviour changing policy. So it's that last bullet point I think was the most dangerous, because we're back here in the government. Let's look at the behaviour at the government at the moment, with the lies and the deceit and the smokescreens over Brexit, the cover-up of child abuse. Can we trust our politicians? No, but they are going to use techniques to change our behaviour to something which is acceptable to them. So immensely dangerous, and I think people have really got to start to speak out about it. And of course, mainstream journalists need to be challenged. It's no good quoting The Guardian. We need to look at the journalists who are supporting this nonsense, and they are the ones who should be challenged in person.
Well, of course, a large part of the shutdown of discussion and the shutdown of free speech on the internet comes via the social media companies, and the British government have been working very closely with them since certainly early 2017 to get them on board and dealing with the problem. Well, here is what the Daily Caller is calling an exclusive. The headline is "Documents detailing Google's new news blacklist show manual manipulation of search results." So what are they saying here? Google does manipulate its search results manually, contrary to the company's official denials. Documents obtained exclusively by the Daily Caller indicate two official policies dubbed the misrepresentation policy and the good neighbor policy inform the company's XPA news blacklist, which is maintained by Google's trust and safety team. Terms and services will be, TNS, the trust and safety team, will be in charge of updating the blacklist when there's a demand. So this is a manually managed blacklist, and that blacklist is then plugged into the algorithms. Now, Google gave the Daily Caller a response to this article, and it's really that I want to sort of look at here, because this is what they said. We do not manually determine the order of any search result, nor do our algorithms or policies attempt to make any judgment on the political leanings of a website. Our Google News inclusion policies are publicly available online. They provide guidelines on content and behaviors for matters like sponsored content, deceptive practices, and more. Sites that do not adhere to these policies are not eligible to appear on news surfaces or in information boxes in search. These policies do not impact the way these sites appear in organic blue ink Google search results. But it's that bit at the front that we've got to read a bit more carefully. They say we do not manually determine the order of any search result. Well, indeed, if what the Daily Caller is saying here is correct, they don't manually determine the order of any search result, but they do manually keep a list of blacklisted websites, which when plugged into the algorithm, then automatically deranks those sites. They then go on to say, nor do our algorithms or policies attempt to make any judgment on the political leanings of a website. Well, indeed, the algorithms don't, because that's a manual process which seems to be run by this trust and safety team. So that is quite a carefully crafted response to make it appear like a denial, but in fact it denies nothing that the Daily Caller has alleged here. Okay.
And there is no doubt this censorship is going on without question. And of course, it was only a few years ago that we had David Cameron very closely linked, I think, with some family relation with the president of the EU, president of Google, a lady whose name escapes me at the moment. And we've seen this time and time again, Nick Clegg moving across to Facebook.
Absolutely.
So these companies are in bed with the politicians are in bed with the big with the big internet companies.
Okay, a quick advertisement here for Crowdfunder, which Robert Stewart has set up on saving Syria's children. The funding is called Saving Syria's Children Did the BBC Live. You want to look on Indiegogo for this. He has raised about £4,500 so far. He's 58 days left to run on this. Please go and have a look at this Indiegogo crowdfunder and do put some money in if you possibly can, because Robert deserves the support for this. He has been absolutely tenacious on this issue of the BBC Saving Syria's Children documentary, which of course the original news report was released just in time for the government vote on whether we would bomb Syria in 2013 or just after that vote. Clearly designed to influence public opinion had the vote gone in the direction opposite to the way it went actually in the end. But nonetheless, this report, Robert has demonstrated that the BBC, for example, were embedded with what apparently were extremist people in Syria, including ISIS. So BBC has some questions to answer there.
They certainly do, and of course if the BBC is prepared to lie over Syria, they're prepared to lie over other matters, including the abuse of children. Now, I just wanted to say that a doctor picked up on our report on the Commissioner for Children in Wales. We came out with this about a week ago, and what they showed, and I did find it quite interesting, I missed it myself when I had a look at the website, was that they were fascinated with the logo. So here it is, and what they're particularly interested in is we have a red dragon sheltering the children. That's one take on it. 13 hands around it, but there is something something distasteful about this.
Yeah.
It's difficult to put your finger on it. It's to do with the cartoon image for a very serious subject. But the doctor, who is a GP working for the NHS, said, I looked at this and more or less it made my skin crawl. So we're going to let people think about what this is. What's the meaning of this logo? Now, the Commissioner herself, ex-social worker, and I just wanted to remind people about the power of the state. The example here is in Wales, but this is coming in through Scotland and it will be coming into England. So what is the role? Well, her job is to tell people why children's rights are so important. This lady needs to tell parents, in particular, about their children and why the child's rights are so important. We don't know this as human beings. We need this lady to tell us. And if we go on down, she says she works for every child in Wales. And the bottom one is the one of interest, up to the age of 25 if they've been in care and are still in education. So the state here now regarding you as a child, not just if you're age 18 or 21, but now 25, you're still a child in the eyes of the state, and you need this woman to help control your life. But I think that the commission regime itself needs to be watched, because it was also pointed out to us that they've got this video clip where they've gone into a primary school in order to get these primary school children to talk about why children's rights are important. Now, this can only have happened, of course, if the children have effectively been groomed and told what they should be talking about. I've blanked out the faces of the children because I think these children are being brutally used in a political sense. But here's a very young little girl, and she's saying, well, if we don't get it right, the children could die from not having water or good food. So now we've got death into the minds of these little children, and it's all put across as if the children are now telling adults how to run these serious issues in society. And the little video clip ends with this one, where another little girl says, I've learned about children's rights. So the Commissioner for Children in Wales going into a school and effectively grooming the children. But what is the policy being put across? Well, of course, it's United Nations policy. And this, of course, we're now seeing through a lot of British political policy, but it's also coming to the surface in many other countries as well.
Mm. Well, Brian, good news. Theresa is in Brussels, wondering what she's going to do now. She's there to meet Donald Tusk. And of course, there's a European Council, an emergency European Council meeting this evening on Article 50. Well, she's there to try and get an extension. She's hoping for a short extension. The EU more likely to offer a long extension of about a year. But in the meantime, I wanted to highlight a letter that Bill Cash has written. So he tweeted this out this morning, Bill Cash MP. My letter to EU Council President Donald Tusk. Any decision by the Prime Minister to accept a long extension to Article 50 is likely to be challenged in the UK courts. So what is he talking about? Well, he said in his letter, it is a fundamental principle of British constitutional law that the government may not use their power, including their powers to make international agreements, so as to frustrate the intention of Parliament. For this purpose, Parliament's intention is to be found and is only to be found in the laws that it makes. In other words, he is saying that Parliament's intention is not expressed, and he does specifically say this later in the letter, Parliament's intention is not expressed through passing motions. This is nonsense. It is only expressed in legislation. The legislation that applies in this case is the Withdrawal Act 2018. And of course, that legislation should not have been, now he doesn't talk about this, but that legislation should not have been amended using a statutory instrument. There was no legal ability to do that because there was a High Court judgment in place which said that particular legislation could only be amended through other primary legislation. It could not be amended through secondary legislation. But nonetheless, He has written to Donald Tusk today, and he has said quite clearly in this letter that Donald Tusk needs to take what he's saying into account when they have their discussions at the European Council this evening, because if Theresa May comes back with a long extension to Brexit, this is very, very likely going to end up in a court case.
Yeah. She looked pretty shell-shocked in that picture, I have to say.
Well,
very.
In fairness, that picture wasn't from today; it was from a couple of weeks ago, but from the previous meeting with Donald Tusk. But yeah, I take your point.
She looked like a chicken in the fox's den.
Yes, well, that's certainly the impression that the mainstream media headlines are giving at the moment. But anyway, let's move over to Iran, and of course, Donald Trump has decided that the Iranian government is effectively terrorists, or the Revolutionary Guard are terrorists. Well, the Iranians decided that, Charmaine Narwai pushed this out earlier on, the Iranian parliament decided that they would get themselves all into uniforms of the Revolutionary Guard in protest at this. But further than that, the Iranian government has decided that the United States is the leader of world terrorism. They said that the US, the vice and deceit of US officials will boomerang on them. They said that because the US troops they're calling them terrorists now following Washington's decision to criticize Iran in this way. And they said, you want to use terrorist groups as tools against the nations of the region. You are the leader of world terrorism. You're propagating and encouraging terrorism in the world. Who wanted to use the Islamic State as a tool? Well, of course, they're accusing the United States of, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence to support that. So I do wonder who's more right here. I suspect Iran is in a better moral position in their accusations.
Yeah, and an interesting reaction, because there's very dry sense of humour under what they've done, which I think is sort of out of character over the years with the way they normally react. It's almost as if other countries are now looking at the West, the US and UK, and saying, you're out of control. We don't know how to deal with you, apart from the fact to laugh at what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, that's true. But of course, the reason Donald Trump has done this is because he seems to be on an absolute pro-Israel bender at the moment. He's just pushing this as hard as he can in every possible way. So anyway, well, it's down to the Chinese apparently to try to inject some sense into this. So they are urging the United States and Iran to avoid escalating the situation. And this is Liu Kang, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, saying, we hope that the relevant countries, especially large non-regional states, in other words, the United States, will make more efforts to promote peace and stability in the Middle East. So, yeah, it's slightly ironic, perhaps, bearing in mind people in the West perception of China, that is China trying to inject some sense into this story.
Somebody needs to.
Well,
somebody
indeed.
needs to.
But let's move on to the F-35. And, well, the picture does not get any better as time goes on. So one of the first 13 F-35As that Japan has taken ownership of has crashed into the sea off the Aomori prefecture. This was on Tuesday evening. It was announced yesterday. It was reported yesterday by the Defence Ministry. According to the Defence Ministry, it's the first crash involving F-35A fighter anywhere in the world. They found a section of the tail, but they haven't found the rest of the aircraft yet, and more seriously, they haven't found the pilot yet, which is a bit sad. So it was one of 9 F-35As that were assembled and checked prior to delivery by Mitsubishi. They had taken the F-35 from Lockheed Martin. They had assembled it, they checked it. There are another 4 that Japan owns that were assembled and checked in the United States. But is this another example of the poor reliability of this aircraft? That's still to be determined, but it's not looking good, is it?
I'm afraid I was smiling there while you were talking, because the sort of self-assembly, I thought to myself, my goodness, this is a sort of IKEA flat pack. You get your box and inside's an F-35, which might be good or it might be a bit dodgy, you don't know.
Yeah.
And this one hasn't worked too well.
Well, indeed. But it doesn't end there, because, of course, we've got the situation in Turkey continuing. So Turkey, we've got to remember, if we go back a while back, Turkey bought some S-400s. The US decided this wasn't a great situation, and so they threatened to stop Turkey from taking possession of the F-35s that they've already bought. And at the time, the Turkish Prime Minister said Ankara will not abandon purchase of Russian S-400 systems despite the US Senate's decision to block F-35 supplies to Turkey. Well, the situation has escalated now. This is the foreign minister of Turkey saying, if the US does not want to sell Patriot to us, tomorrow we may buy another S-400 system, and we can also purchase other air defense systems. This argument continues to build. He said that it was nonsense that some countries have put into question whether Turkey should even be a member of NATO, bearing in mind that they'd be buying S-400s. But he went on to say this. He said, if we can't have F-35 jets, we'll be forced to satisfy our fighter jet needs elsewhere. And I feel like saying to Turkey at this point, you might want to seriously consider that, because the F-35 continues to demonstrate that it appears to be a lemon. I suspect other options may be better options. But the question still remains, Brian, where does this leave Britain's F-35s? Because, of course, Turkey, part of this sort of global consortium of countries involved in the F-35 project. And part of the deal was that various maintenance tasks and so on would be distributed amongst all the members of the consortium. Turkey was due to be managing the maintenance of engines. So they're not getting any parts. They're actually not getting any parts of any kind. So what happens to British F-35s? Where are they going to be maintained, the parts?
We don't know, but you look at it from a common sense point of view, and of course there's no common sense in anything. Everything to do with aircraft is to do with keeping it tight, very, very high standards of construction and testing so that they're safe and they operate. And the more you dilute this across nation states, the worse it's going to get. I mean, that's just it. So this is not about Britain's defence policy. This is global industrialists selling their wares, and the governments are simply doing as they're told. So this is nothing to do with UK defence policy. This is the military industrial complex pushing out its wares. And if I'm smiling slightly, it's because somebody in our chat box has said, yes, the only trouble with assembling a flat pack F-35 is when you find those little bits left over, which of course we've all had when we've assembled a table or chairs or unit from one of the flat pack companies. I had a few bits of my F-35 left over, but I just pushed those to one side and forgot about them. There's something very deep going on here, Mike. This is not normal politics, because these decisions are not being made in national parliaments. So let's go over to New Zealand, and there's quite a few of the media outlets at the moment are on the subject of the gun ban as a result of the Christchurch incident. So I picked The Guardian here. New Zealand MPs overwhelmingly back post-Christchurch gun ban. And of course the BBC, Christchurch shootings, New Zealand MPs vote to change gun laws. It's fascinating how, as we're seeing problems in nations across the world where people are beginning to say we don't trust our government, they're beginning to come forward and protest. And what have we now got started? Gun bans. But following this story through was quite interesting. Here's Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister. She said New Zealand stands apart in its widespread availability of weapons of such destructive nature and force. Today that anomaly ends. I don't quite see how New Zealand stands apart. I would have thought America would be at the forefront of that, but apparently it's New Zealand. She went on, she could not fathom how weapons that could cause such destruction and large-scale death could have been obtained legally in this country. I could not fathom that. Well, did she not realise that her own government or governments in New Zealand would have been passing legislation which actually allowed this situation to happen? She's very confused as to how the system works, because these were legally obtained. They weren't obtained on the black market, but she doesn't really understand how that could have happened. And she went on, she said, I could not, hand on heart, go down and face not just the media, not just the public, but the victims that have been left behind from this terror attack, and tell them, hand on heart, that our system and our laws allow these guns to be available, and that was okay, because it was not. I made a decision that after the police commission briefing, that I'd go down that day and, without having the chance to question the Parliament, know that Parliament would be with me, and they were. Now, this is a very strange article because it ends without giving you any detail of what they're talking about. But I think what they're talking about is she went down and told the public that she was going to get rid of these guns, and then miraculously Parliament votes 99.9% for banning these automatic weapons. So we've got a Prime Minister who simply dispenses with Parliament and says what's going to happen.
Yes.
It's very strange stuff. Now, I found this article, which I found very, very interesting, by a lady called Kate Hawkesby, Why Jacinda Ardern Will Be a One-Term Prime Minister. Now, this is what she had to say. She'll be a one-term Prime Minister not because she's no good, quite the opposite, because she's a rock star who's ready to move on. That's an interesting description. Then it gets better. Why? Because when you're this young and you make this big of an impact internationally, when you are lauded on the international stage to the degree she's been this year, you strike while the iron is hot. The spotlight is on her, and it's a good time to be a woman, and a competent one at that. What is the world desperate for right now? Capable, compassionate women, box ticked. If the UN aren't sniffing around her yet, I'd be surprised, and if they are, my pick is she'll go. Ardern's had a taste of the international scene. She's handled it with aplomb. Everything the UN stands for aligns with her own beliefs. She's big on ideology, a fan of discussion and consultation. She's empathetic, perfect UN material.
Well, that explains why she sidelines Parliament then. She's
only 38 years old, so this isn't a question of her ideology. This is a question of her following United Nations ideology. That's the bit I think is really interesting. And of course, remember that we're talking about the sheer amount of UN policy which is now being implemented in this country without any discussion with the wider public. And I'm going to thank one of our viewers for this story here from the Mail. The government's plan to ban junk food adverts before 9 p.m. will cut just 2 calories a day from children's diets, according to its own research. Now, this is a very puffed up article, but it has to be said that it's amazing that the government is getting very excited all of a sudden about junk food, and it's going to look after our health, and it's going to tackle obesity. There's a nice children's cartoon there, and what was of great interest was the little clip I've got on screen showing children's park. And of course, we've only got to go back a little bit, 2010, to see reports that 144 school playing fields were going to be sold off. And this is a direct result of government education policy. And we're also seeing green spaces rooted out of city areas, and all of those green areas which get people out and about and get children exercising, those are all going as a result of government policy, which then points a finger and says, you're all too fat.
Right. So they get rid of the playing fields, they get rid of the exercise, then they complain that people are too fat, then they've got to impose some kind of draconian behavioural change.
Indeed.
Yes, you can see how that works.
We can. And we'll just end on this one. And thank you to a doctor that pointed this out to us. You can find this as a little YouTube video clip. But a couple of weeks ago, Rockland County, New York, declared county-wide state of emergency. And you say, what was this for? Well, it was this. They basically said that they were having such a problem with measles that if you had not been vaccinated, you were not to go in any public spaces. And if you did, you could be fined $500, I think it was $500 and or imprisoned.
For 6 months? Up to 6 months?
For up to 6 months,
yes.
Yeah. So there we are. This is our policy. Where do I think this policy is coming from? This is United Nations vaccination policy. And now we can see how draconian it can get. I mean, we've had measles around for quite a few years. Can be a problem. But the doctor in question said this is utter nonsense if you look at the efficacy of the vaccinations versus the danger of the disease. Well, that's it for today. A snippet from our chat box while we've been speaking for the news today is that the BBC is planning to move operations to Holland after Brexit. We'll have to do some work on that, but that sounds an interesting state of play.
Is it April the 1st?
Well, it's not, but we'll follow it through and see where we get. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back at the same time on Friday. Bye-bye.